Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to today's episode of the Product Angle Show. And on today's episode, we have the co-founder of Product Collective, which also hosts industry conference, which is usually in Cleveland, Ohio, and Dublin, Ireland. Our guest is also the co-host of a startup podcast called Rocketship.fm. And I'd like to introduce our guest for today's show, Mike Belsito. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I appreciate you coming on, and I'm super excited to talk to you about pivoting your conference to a virtual environment. But before we get started into the topic, I'd like to get to know you a little bit, right? Tell us something that we cannot Google about you.
Yeah, I think one thing that you probably couldn't Google, at least as far as I can remember, is that I used to be the voice of Case Western Reserve basketball games, that's a college that I went to for business school.
Okay.
And if you were to go to a basketball game and you were to hear like starting at guard, that was me. I was actually the one doing that. So I had a lot of fun. I majored in sport management in college. And so a lot of my experience when I was in college and business school was actually sports business related. So I had fun doing that.
Excellent. That's pretty good. Yeah. And you got the voice for it as well.
Yeah, that helped me develop this like podcast voice now, I guess, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, how did you get started in product management? Is this something that you made a conscious decision or something you fell into?
It's definitely not something I made a conscious decision of. In fact, I didn't even know what being a product person really meant. Although I was a product person without realizing it. And so I'll back up a little bit. All of my career after business school. So I graduated in 2005. So 15 years or so has been involved in early stage technology startups. And, first I was an early employee at a company that I was employee number one, and we grew to over 150 people, I think, by the time I had left. We were doing about $20 million in annual revenue. And so being there was awesome to have a front row seat at what it took to actually build a technology startup company. I left there to launch my own company with the first developer from that company. We launched a company called eFuneral, and I was kind of the business and product guy, and he was definitely the tech guy, the developer, so to speak. But I was being a product person without realizing it. I wasn't in my mind. That wasn't a moniker I was even necessarily like taking on consciously. But when I look back at what I was actually doing, I was really being that initial product person for our startup. And we had that company for about 3 years, and it was acquired, but I always call it a fail sale. Like we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve. It wasn't the kind of acquisition I was putting any press releases out about. But I then had to decide what I was going to do next. And I knew I'd probably get involved in starting something else at some point, but I started having some companies that were recruiting me. And one of those companies was a ticketing company. They do ticketing for pro sports teams and college sports teams, the Final Four. They recruited me to be their director of product strategy. And I remember when I was having lunch with the person that was recruiting me, and I said, look, this sounds really cool. Like I have an undergraduate degree in sport management. Like that's kind of cool that I could combine, the current with then. But I didn't go to school for product management. Like, I don't know if I'd be the best fit for this. And she was like, oh no, Mike, nobody went to school for product management. Like you'll be just fine. And so I took on that product role. But in my mind, I'm like, well, what happens when they figure out I don't know what I'm doing? And so really I was like learning on the fly, reading a lot of books and blogs, listening to podcasts, trying to figure out what it meant to be a product person. So it was absolutely not a conscious decision. But again, when I think back to what I was doing at eFuneral, that startup company that I helped co-found, I was that product person. I just didn't really realize it.
Definitely. I think that's been similar to how I started. I started doing product work, and at that time, I think I started around about 2002, 2003, and there was no such term as product manager. Product wasn't even really a thing back then, as far as I remember. But same story, you start doing something, and it now looks, when I look back, it's what product people do.
Right. Yeah. Well, and if we really think about it, the internet is relatively young, compared to so many other industries. So like I am old enough to remember life without the internet. But so yeah, it makes sense that product management hasn't necessarily been at this like dedicated sort of profession, if you will. Although like I think it's existed for a long time. It's just we now finally have a name for it.
Yeah, fair enough. Makes sense. So tell me about Product Collective and the industry conference.
Yeah. Well, and I could rewind back to that time where I had that product role. What happened is, again, I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a product person. I was figuring out that the best way for me to do that was by putting myself in the company of other product people. And so, living here in Cleveland, Ohio, there are product people here, and I was learning from people that were here. But as we know, there are a lot of other product people throughout the world, especially when you think of places like the coasts, whether it's New York where you're at or the Bay Area. And so in my mind, I'm like, well, how can I bring these product people to me? And so actually, before we even started the Product Collective community, I remember meeting Paul McAvinci, who was a friend of mine here in Cleveland. He ran this series of tech. It was called Tech Pint, but basically it's sort of like a meetup that would happen at a bar that would be for the broader tech community here in Cleveland. And he put on the first sort of one-day conference version of that. But it was, so I'd classify it as like a local tech conference, single day local tech conference. And he asked me to speak at it. And so I spoke at that, and it was a lot of fun. And I remember going to lunch with him afterwards where he wanted my feedback as a speaker and a friend. And I remember saying, look, I think it was fun. People turned up, they seemed to have a good time, but there's a lot of these kind of broad, even in Cleveland, just broad tech conferences. What you ought to do is, I'm trying to figure out what it means to be a product person. What if you were to focus on a specific area within tech? Maybe it's product. There's not a lot of other things out there for people like me. There's some things, but not a lot. Like, what if you could sort of hang your hat on that? And he's like, well, you sound pretty passionate about this, Mike. Like, what if we were to do it together? And that was the end of 2014. And I remember we very quickly started putting our heads together to say, okay, what if we can reposition what you already built? And instead of it being this local tech conference, what if we can make it into something that is a product conference that isn't just for people in our neck of the woods? But this shows you how big we were thinking at the time. But I'm like, what if people in Columbus, Ohio came? What if people in Pittsburgh came? Like, I was thinking a 2-hour driving distance radius, right? And so we did that. We put on that conference. We planned it for fall of 2015. We both still had full-time jobs. But what happened is that year, and by the way, we had no budget, no community, no audience. Our marketing was waking up at like 5 a.m. every day and going onto LinkedIn and just hunting down product people. And I would just guess at their email, which is easy enough to guess these days. Yeah. And I would just say like, hey, I'm a product person like you, like putting together this thing, what do you think about it? And that year, 200 people came. So it was modest in terms of total numbers, but they came from 21 states and 7 countries, even in that first year. And I remember walking around at the happy hour we had, and where I was talking to people. And I remember asking somebody, I'm like, so where are you from? And he said, oh, China. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like, what brings you to Cleveland? He's like, oh, this conference. And I'm like, right. Well, of course, that, but in my mind, that sort of blew me away because we were thinking so like just 2-hour driving distance radius, but that's how it started. So Product Collective, now we like to think of ourselves as a community for product people. We do put on that conference, but we do a number of things like live video Q&A chats that we host twice a month. We have a newsletter that goes out to, I think it's now like 35,000 people every week. Wow. I co-host Rocket Ship FM, which is a lot of fun. So all of those things are meant to really add value to product people year round, because after that first year of the conference, we asked ourselves, 2 questions. We said, 1, what could this have been if we were both full-time into this? Like if this wasn't sort of the side thing for both of us, and how can we create a path to get us to that? And then 2, this is 2 days of the year. How else can we help product people those 363 days? So that's, we started establishing some of those other things, a Slack community. But that's how it all started.
That's awesome. I mean, I was honestly not expecting 2014, 2015. I'm thinking in my mind that you're going to come back and tell me like 2006, 2007, and you've been doing this for years. So what you've achieved since 2014, 15, what you've blown it up to be, it's amazing. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So are you and Paul full-time on this now?
We are, yeah. So I've been full-time since right before the 2016 conference. So we put on that 2015 conference, and it was just a few months late. Well, the next year's conference was in the fall. So it was either September or October. And I think it was the July before that I went in full-time. And then right after the conference, Paul went in full-time. So yeah, we were able to, less than a year after it launched, I came in, and then Paul was in, and there's actually three of us. Rebecca Feliciano, she's another third person. So it's the three of us full-time year round. And then, depending on the time of year, if we've got a conference coming up, there's other people that are involved with certain things. Like we have somebody that helps us with assisting sponsors, particularly when we have the in-person conference. There's an on-site event director, where she's the one that's keeping track of, like, to the minute when people should be walking out on stage and coming back. And it's not just those 2 days, 3 days that we're having the conference, but it's like the time leading up to it too. So I mean, if you count everybody that touches the conference in a year, might be 20, 30 people, but there's three of us that are on it full-time year round.
That makes sense. So let's move to, I guess, 2020 right now. And usually September would September be Ohio, or would September be Ireland?
September. So we always have our flagship conference, which happens in the US, specifically in Cleveland, Ohio, in the fall. And then our European conference we introduced in 17 or 8. I think it's 2018, maybe, in March of 2018. So it's always in the springtime. So we've done 3 versions of that now. And we actually did have our European conference in Dublin this year, March 9th through 11th. And then March 12th is when it felt like the world closed down. So it was, I still feel like I might be a little scarred from seeing like, hey, is this even going to happen? And then we got it all off, and we put on a great show. But then again, the next day, events in Ireland were banned. I think we put on the last conference in all of Ireland, which was just kind of crazy. But yeah, so 2020 September would have been Cleveland, but we have since canceled the in-person edition, which we're really bummed about. But obviously, it's just out of necessity, and it's fine. We will gather back in person when we can. But for this year, September is now going to be virtual. So the benefit of that is you don't have to hop on a plane to get here. We've made ticket prices way more affordable, honestly, compared to what the in-person edition would be, travel aside. And then there's certain things that we're able to do that we weren't able to do before. Like this is just as a fun aside, but one of my favorite musicians, Ben Folds, is performing, a virtual set just for industry attendees. We would not be able to afford to have Ben Folds with us in person in Cleveland. Unfortunately, I would love to think that we could, but we were able to make it happen for this virtual conference. So there's some fun things that included that we're able to do that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
So talk us through, you're sitting with your team and thinking, okay, this year, for obvious reasons, in-person events are effectively canceled.
Yeah.
Talk us through that moment where, you're talking with your team, your partners, and how are you creating that vision for what a virtual conference looks like?
Yeah, I would love to be able to tell you that it was like, well, it was already on our roadmap. And so we were just, this was all intentional. No, we what was on our roadmap got completely thrown in the trash. And this was all out of necessity, not just necessity, but it's like, we had to reinvent our business basically. So, I could tell you being in Dublin like that and being in Dublin when it felt like the world was falling apart, that, like I said, kind of scarred me and still has, those scars are going to live on forever. But I remember like speakers on stage and, there are people there, but mind you, probably about half of the attendees that had registered actually turned up. The other half stayed behind. And we knew that was going to, 10 days beforehand, there was a lower dropout rate than the year before. So everything happened so quickly. So the 2 days before the conference, we knew that would probably be the case. But even still, speakers on stage speaking, people are having a good time. But inside, I'm like, there's no way we're going to be able to put a conference on in September. And I wanted to believe, so right then I knew that that was a possibility. We started, I will also say, like in April, early April, we had planned a in-person standalone workshop in New York City with Rich Mironov, one of industry speakers and workshop facilitators who's done amazing work for us. And so at first, our sights were set on New York. They sort of had to be. That was like coming up in 3 to 4 weeks. And I'm like, that is not going to happen. And we're going to have to refund everybody. We're going to have to cancel that. But I remember thinking like, well, or is there a way that we don't have to necessarily cancel that? And I called Rich while I'm still in Dublin. We had a Zoom call. Like the night the conference ended, I went back to my hotel room and I was not celebrating quite yet. I was like Zooming with Rich, trying to figure this all out. He had not done a lot of virtual workshops before that. And so I said, hey, look, might it be possible to convert this to virtual? And what might that look like? And he's like, okay, well, I had planned this as in person. Like that's always been the plan, but let's see if we could figure something out. And so we did. And we gave attendees the option of just getting a full refund if they want, or they could get a little bit of a refund from what they had already paid for the in-person workshop, and they could take part in a virtual workshop. And we had no idea what platform we would use. We had no idea like what that format would be, how we can help make things easy for Rich as the facilitator. But we said, look, Rich, let's assume we will figure all that out. Like when I get back to Cleveland, let's just assume we'll figure all that out.
Yeah.
What would the ideal situation look like on your end? And so we started to put together what that could look like. I started reaching out to attendees while I was still in Dublin, and 80% of the attendees, maybe even more, maybe closer to 85 or 90%, but it was the vast majority of attendees opted into the virtual conference. We had very few people request a full refund. And so that told us two things. One, we might have a product that we can actually start putting out there right when we get back, with not just Rich, but other people. We had this space that we had to reserve months in advance for New York. We don't need to reserve a space months in advance now for doing virtual workshops. Two, it told us that people are willing to pay for virtual experiences if they view them to be high quality. And that workshop, I think the price that we were charging at that time was $425 or so, something like that. So that, which is not insignificant, that's still a significant amount of money for a half-day workshop, in my opinion. And so we said, okay, how can we start to productize this? And it was 13 days after we got back from Ireland where we announced industry virtual workshops, where it wasn't just that workshop, but other workshops that we were announcing with other speakers and facilitators that we had great relationships with. And from that point in time, from April through June, we've taken July and August off just for the summer and to prepare for industry virtual. But from April through June, we put on virtual workshops at a tune of about one a week. In some cases, there were more than one a week. And they were from anywhere from 8 people to over 50 people for some of these workshops. So that was an eye-opening for us, but it sort of forced us to reinvent our business a bit. But it also, like the next few weeks after we got back, because I'll tell you, like on the airplane ride back, I'm like, well, our conference in Cleveland's definitely going to be affected by this. Like we're going to have a lot fewer attendees, I'm sure. Then like each day that goes on, I'm like, well, we're not going to have any attend. Like it's just not going to be possible to put on a conference, right? Yeah. And I wish you could see the future, like because I'm not knowing at that time if like this will all be over by the fall or what. Like obviously, if we knew what the situation would be now, it would be an easier decision. But it probably wasn't until I think late April when it was pretty clear. I think it would have been around that where it's like, it's just not going to be possible. Like it's going to be impossible to put one on. We're going to have to cancel that. But if we're going to cancel that, what does a virtual experience look like? And so we just kept asking ourselves, how can we put on something that is just not, hey, here's a day of talks and that's that. We tried to think about when people come to industry in Cleveland, what are they coming for? Like what problems are they trying to solve? Like what value are they trying to get out of it? And how can we replicate that? Not by, not by feature, meaning like, well, hey, if you have a happy hour event, you're going to have a happy hour event for the virtual conference. But it's like, no, if they came for networking, how else can we help them network with people at a virtual type event? And so we tried to think of all those reasons why people come to the in-person conference, and then create an experience that gives them those things, but in a much different way through the virtual experience. And so I think it was mid-May when we announced that industry virtual would be a thing. And then that's happening September 22nd and 23rd.
Definitely. I mean, you've answered some of the questions right there, because going to a conference to me is the ability just to bump into people and say, oh, hey, I remember reading about you, or, knowing about you from whatever article or book or whatever it may be. And that's when you can get access to, the Rich Murnoffs and the Aprils and, all the product people of the world. You can bump into them, shake their hand and say hi to them. But now with a virtual environment, getting that interaction is somewhat limited, but I'm sure you've thought about how they can still interact with the speakers and, meeting random people just throughout the day.
Totally. Yeah. And you hit on it. I mean, it's like people are coming for not just if it was just for the content, and it's great content, but if it was just for the content, you could go on YouTube and put any topic, and you could plan a day of talks for yourself. Right now you could just plan that, and you'd learn a lot too. But you're right. People come to connect with that person that's on stage in some way. People come to meet that person that might be sitting next to them, who maybe that person is going to hire them for their next job. Maybe the person on the other side is going to start a company with them someday. Like maybe somebody else is going to be a customer or partner for them. So how do you connect people to those other individuals, particularly now where we're not going to be in the same place physically? And so we were thinking of how we can best do that. We were starting to look at virtual conference platforms, which, by the way, are so new because all of this, like the demand is right now. Like a year ago, people were not looking at virtual conferences as a necessary thing. So there really weren't a lot of things out there aside from, things like using Zoom or something for like a day long, Zoom. So we started looking at the platform, like the one we're using, Hoppin. They allow for one-on-one video networking. It's almost like chat roulette style. And in some ways, we've actually run some tests, did some test runs with Product Collective members. They're like, I actually think in some ways there are more benefits to this because look, this isn't me personally, but people are talking to, they're like, I'm kind of an introvert. So I come to events and I don't just go up to somebody and introduce myself. And I'm like, you know what? I get that. And we've had kind of solutions for that at industry. Like we do things to try to connect people. But for this, like that one-on-one video networking, you just press a button and all of a sudden you're getting matched with people. So that's one way. I mean, we'll have small group discussions that are available for our attendees where it's, they might be able to have that discussion with one of the speakers that was just on stage, but they might get value from having a discussion just with their peers. And so they can opt in to have these discussions. Aside from all the talks that will be happening, every one of the speakers is also taking part in interactive Q&A sessions. So attendees can ask that burning question they had for that speaker. So it's another way to connect. So those are just some examples, but I mean, we've been doing this for the in-person version too, because a lot of those challenges still exist even when you do get people in person. And so we will have some surprises for attendees too, just kind of some delighters in ways that we connect them to each other as well. But those are some of the ways that we're working on right now.
Definitely. It sounds exciting. And from a platform perspective, Hoppin, I've been a speaker at a previous conference using the platform Hoppin, and I've also attended a conference using Hoppin, and it definitely is a change to how you interact with people. And it's definitely, I think, that a good path forward, if you will.
Yeah. And it's, it's a new product. So there's going to be things that they'll learn through it, that will help them learn through it, that we'll learn on our own as well. But yeah, like compared to, some of the platforms that are out there and have been out there for a long time, that they didn't think about some of those interactive kind of how to connect people. And so that's what we liked about it. And look, we're product people. We're willing to be a little bit on that bleeding edge. And so, we're excited for it.
Definitely. What would you say some of your challenges are? Obviously if you were in person conference, you need to figure out food and space. Besides that, what are the other challenges that you've seen, organizing a virtual conference?
Yeah, I think so. There are definitely a lot of challenges with the virtual conference. In some ways, there's some benefits too, in that some people that would have never been able to come to our conference because maybe they wouldn't have been able to get travel budget approval, or ticket to industry. The day of show rate is $995. Average cost for a ticket to industry virtuals less than $200. So some ways there's some benefits there, but the drawback is also, like, it is virtual. So some people might just be like wary of what that virtual experience looks like. So even just be able to communicate the value, that is one big challenge. Another big challenge is thinking about that attendee experience. Once they walk in the door at Public Auditorium in Cleveland, Ohio, they're with us, right? And they don't want to be anywhere else. The venue that we have in Cleveland, it's a beautiful venue. It's the oldest performance hall in Cleveland. It's where the Beatles performed and Elvis performed. Like, it has history. And so you're coming into the industry experience, and you're in that experience for all day, basically, until you go home to your hotel room. With virtual, you're in the experience unless you turn your head, unless you get up to go to the bathroom, and then maybe your day gets derailed a little bit. Like, it's a lot easier to get sidetracked when you're in a virtual experience. So we're trying to think of, okay, once somebody logs in, how do we, not that, I mean, look, maybe somebody's buying a ticket knowing, okay, I can only experience, a couple of the talks, some of the features, but I'm not going to be tuned in my computer for 12 hours. We don't expect somebody to be tuned into their computer the entire time, but even still, how do we keep them engaged during the time that they are coming on? That's a really big challenge. And that's something that we're constantly thinking of. And then on the sponsor side, we have sponsors are important to us. Like, one of the things that I've taken pride in is, like, sponsors are, to me, like, they add to the experience at industry. And at some conferences, it's not the case. Some conferences, they end up detracting from the experience for whatever reason. There's too many of them. It's not well thought out how the booths would be, compared to the rest of the hall. And so, but at industry, it's always added to the experience. At least that's the feedback that we've gotten from attendees, and sponsors love that because it puts them in a positive light. But how can we continue to put them in a positive light? How can we encourage attendees to check out what they've got in the virtual exhibit hall? So all of that, like, those are definitely big challenges that are constantly on our mind. And, we think we have some solutions for them, but the reality is, like, this is all new. So we're going to need to see.
Definitely. Can you talk a little bit about your pricing strategy? Because pricing is a sensitive topic, and there's budgets and all kinds of different factors that go into it, the perceived value, and what have you. Now, traditionally, when I think of pricing, I've thought about having an early bird, maybe then a regular price, maybe a VIP, or whatever it may be, right? Can you talk us a little bit about how you think about pricing and the pricing strategy that goes into creating industry conference?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we've talked through every year. We constantly are talking about pricing, and if we need to tweak it, if it's if it needs any work. I will say we took a lot of cues from a conference called Content Marketing World. Content Marketing World is a conference here in Cleveland, Ohio. It was started by somebody who's become a mentor to us. When he first started the company, there were maybe 300 people that came to his first year. And then the next year is more like 500-600. Fast forward 7-8 years in, he had 3,500 people coming to that conference. Wow. It's the largest recurring tech conference in Cleveland. And so, plenty of other big tech conferences out there beyond Cleveland, but in Cleveland, that, 3,500 people, that it's a significant thing. And I mean, and he sold his company, by the way, for a lot of money. But so for him to basically just be a mentor to us and kind of open up his playbook to say, hey, look, this is how I built my conference from scratch. And this is how I continue to evolve it and iterate it. And that's been super helpful to us. And so one of the things that we learned from him was just the importance of pricing, and not to say that we're doing it the same way as Content Marketing World. In fact, when we shared with him, like, where we landed, this was in year 2. He's like, wow, okay. I'm curious to see, because how they had it was like, there's an early bird price, and then there's a second early bird rate where it goes up a little bit, and then the final price. we said, well, what if we did that every month? And so we had a day of show rate. And that's right now, this is for the in-person conference. That's set at $9.95. But when we first introduced tickets, like we sell a lot of tickets to that conference 11 months in advance. When it goes on sale 11 months in advance, you're able to get that for 40% off. So you're not paying $9.95. You're buying 11 months in advance. You're paying $5.95. And then if you want to add a half-day workshop, there's a ticket that's a little bit more expensive for that. But every month, the ticket price goes up a little bit until it reaches that day of show rate. So what we like about it is that every month there's incentive for people to buy. I can say to somebody, well, hey, like at the end of this month, pricing does go up a little bit. And so for those that money, saving some money is important to them, that's not necessarily an important thing to everybody, but for those that it is an important thing, there's incentive for them. It also allows us to offer, like, yes, it's not, I feel good about that day of show rate in terms of comparing it to comparable conferences of the same caliber. Like ours is a 2-day conference. There are 1-day conferences that have the same caliber of speakers, the same audience, that it's the same price. 1-day conference, and ours is 2. So I feel like ours is already a tremendous value. I'm not saying that it's cheap or inexpensive, but it's a good value for what you're getting compared to alternatives. But the fact that we can offer that for almost half the cost 11 months in advance, like I feel good about being able to do that. So that's for the in-person conferences. For the virtual conference, it's similar, but we had less time to plan to sort of kick off pricing. We only offered it in mid-May. The conference is in September. But we also had more opportunity to make it affordable for people, and that was important to us. Like the reality is we don't have to pay for a venue. We don't have to pay for food and beverage. There are costs. I mean, just because it's virtual doesn't mean that there's no cost. There are significant costs, tens of thousands of dollars and fixed costs, right? For various things, because we want to make this a world-class experience for people. But because we're able to cut out a lot of those, especially like per person costs, we're able to make that ticket price a lot more affordable. So instead of people paying a range of $9.95 to $15.95 if they were adding a workshop, our pricing started at $99. The very early bird rate, the lowest price you could pay was $99. And even now it's in that $150 to $250 range, depending on what kind of ticket you purchase. And so when you compare what you're getting, and also you don't have to pay for travel this time. And just think about like, okay, well, what else can I spend, when I'm spending $250 on educational content, how does this compare? We think it's an incredible value. We always do make discounts available. There is a discount even for people that are watching right now. I think I just created one, Product Angle 20. Yeah. Let's
Thank
save
you so
20%.
much.
You're welcome. But no, we really try to make discounts available on top of that to groups and nonprofits. We have a scholarship program that we established with Balsamic. So every year, and same goes for virtual, we're giving away over 50 scholarships for those that are in financial, because of financial reasons, they wouldn't have been able to buy a ticket. And those scholarships we also give special preference to those that are coming from underrepresented groups within tech. Yeah. So I mention all that because yes, I mentioned what our pricing is, but we try, there are other ways we're trying to make it not just affordable for people, but also make sure that people that wouldn't have been able to pay, they can still be there and get value out of it.
Definitely. Now, in terms of getting tickets, where can people buy these tickets?
Yeah, you could check out all the details at industryconference.com/virtual. And that has all the details there. It shares some of the speakers, like Jason Fried of Basecamp. He's kind of made industry a bit of a residency for him. I think he spoke in the last 3 years, and he's always been, I can't even say I wish I could call him as a mentor, kind of like my product idol, my entrepreneurial idol too. Yeah. So the fact that he comes every year and is excited to come, like, means so much to us. He and Ryan Singer together, who's the head of strategy at Basecamp, they're going to be giving a fireside chat specifically on how they launched hey.com. Okay. And which is brand new email service that's competing with Google.
Exciting.
Which is,
super exciting.
So there's a couple other fireside chats, like with Julie Zhu. She's the author of The Making of a Manager. But most of these talks, there are keynote style presentations. People like Christian Idiotti, he's he's a partner at Silicon Valley Product Group. There are CPOs. There's also people that are speaking that are coming from the product manager level. Jules Walter, for instance, he's somebody that he was scheduled to, actually, I mentioned him, where he's actually going to be speaking next year in knock on wood in Cleveland if we have it. It was going to work out for this year, so I mentioned his name sort of inadvertently there. But there's like 20 speakers that are coming to speak. Beyond that, we even have a virtual performance by Ben Folds just for industry attendees. There's a 6-episode mini series of Rocket Ship FM just for industry attendees. We hire a journalist to take notes on every talk. That's just for industry attendees. So beyond being able to like watch and take part in the discussions and all of that, there's all these other sort of value adds that we've been putting on for the conference that we think will make it an even better value too.
Absolutely. I'm super excited for this year. And now that you've mentioned the names for next year, that's getting people's appetites wet for next year as well.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm excited for that. I mean, yeah, it's funny. Like now we're at the point where we do plan things out a year in advance. Like Mark Duplass, he's a filmmaker. He's done HBO shows. He's done movies, TV shows. He's set to speak next year in Cleveland as well. And you know, we know that we're in this world where who knows what October 2021 looks like, but if it's not in Cleveland, I'm sure it'll be virtual again, but you know what? It'll be nice when we can get back to a time where we can gather in person, because that in-person experience, that'll be something special too. I think no matter, like, my take on all of this is like, even when we get back to times where we can have in-person experiences though, I know for us, we will always have this virtual conference. Like, this is going to be a regular thing for us. Like, this isn't just like hey, it's in a pinch, so let's just put this virtual experience together. Like, as we've started to build this out, we think this is something special. And so every year, you know, for people that want the virtual experience, we're going to make it available for them. And we're excited for that.
Exciting times coming in the future. Now, what advice, before we close out, I appreciate your time. What advice would you give to someone looking to start their career in product?
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces of advice. One would be to just talk to and connect with as many product people as you can. And sometimes that means in your own organization. Maybe you're working in customer success. Maybe you're working in UX. That's actually a great path to get into product, is by sort of making your way into product in your own organization already. So, you know, being able to talk to the product people that are in your own company and asking them, you know, how can you be more helpful to them? How can you work more closely with them? How can you learn about how they do product? I think it's a great way to start to get your feet wet, so to speak. Let's just say you're not in any, you know, you want to get into product, but you're coming from a completely different area. Starting something on your own, like anything, you know, even just a side project, but going through that process of getting something out there, getting customers to become familiar with it, getting feedback from those customers, iterating the product itself. Like, you're doing product work, and that will help you then if you're going to try to find a product role as you're breaking into product. Like, those experiences will help you. Those experiences will let hiring managers know that you're even more credible and more, you know, applicable for the role. So that would be another thing I would do, is just, if you have never created a product on your own before, figure out a way to create one. I mean, there's no code platforms out there. You don't necessarily even need to be a developer now to create a technology product. So granted, there's people that are out there that are looking for partners, looking for people to collaborate with. So I think those would be the biggest pieces of feedback that I would give people. And, you know, I'm an adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve University, which is actually where I went to business school. And I teach their only undergraduate product management class, which I wish existed back, you know, when I was in school. But, you know, that's the same advice I give the students, is like, hey, look, I never had this class. So you're already much farther along than I was at your point, but go out there and try to talk to people, try to make stuff, and then take it from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mike. Super excited for anyone who wants to use the discount code for Virtual Industry Conference. And thank you so much for being on the show, and good luck and all the best for September and the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.